fire swept through a wooden on Oker Point in Newport. By morning, nothing remained but ashes and two fire-damaged safes containing Alice Vanderbilt's jewelry. The house had been called the Breakers, named for the waves that crashed against the cliffs below. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had purchased it 7 years earlier from tobacco heir Pierre Lorillard for nearly $500,000. He had spent another $500,000 improving it. Now it was gone. For most families, such a loss would have been devastating. For Cornelius Vanderbilt, it was an opportunity. That same year, his younger brother William Kissam had completed Marble House on Bellevue Avenue. The $11 million palace had transformed Newport and established William and Alva as the undisputed leaders of summer society. Cornelius was the senior member of the Vanderbilt family, the chairman of the New York Central Railroad, the man who had inherited the bulk of their father's fortune. Yet his brother's summer cottage had surpassed anything he owned. The fire changed that calculation. Within 6 weeks, Cornelius had hired Richard Morris Hunt to design a replacement. The architect had just finished marble. Construction began in the spring of 18. broken into Mrs. Astor's world, spent her final years in France, near her daughter Consuelo. The daughter she had forced into marriage with the Duke. The daughter who had eventually forgiven her. Mother and daughter had reconciled over their shared commitment to women's rights, and Consuelo had spoken at suffrage gatherings that Alba organized. Alba suffered a stroke in 1932 that left her partially paralyzed. She died in Paris on January 26, 1933. Her funeral at St. Thomas Episcopal Church in New York featured all-female pallbearers. Her casket was flanked by members of the National Woman's Party. She left $100,000 to the organization in her will. She had begun her public life as a society woman determined to storm the gates of old money. She ended it as an activist determined to tear down the barriers that excluded half the population from political life. The ballrooms she had stormed were empty now. The mansions she had built were being sold or demolished. The society she had infiltrated no longer existed in any recognizable form. Her children inherited what remained, but the fortune was smaller than it had once been. The taxes were higher. The world was different. And the houses, those magnificent houses that had announced to New York and Newport and the world that the Vanderbilts had arrived, were becoming too expensive to maintain. Chapter 11. The Mansions That Vanished. They came down faster than they had gone up. In 1926, the wrecking balls arrived on Fifth Avenue. One by one, the great houses that had defined New York society for a generation were reduced to rubble. The limestone and marble that had taken years to quarry and carve was hauled away in weeks. The ballrooms where the 400 had danced became empty lots, then construction sites, then department stores. The Petit Chateau went first. The house that Alba Vanderbilt had built to announce her family's arrival, the house where she had hosted the ball that conquered Mrs. Astor, sold to a real estate developer named Benjamin Winter. He paid for the land, not the building. The mansion that had cost $3 million to construct in 1882 was demolished in the spring of 1926. In its place rose a 20-story commercial building. Today, a clothing store occupies the ground floor. Alba, by then Mrs. Bellman, noted the demolition in passing in a draft of her memoirs. She did not linger on the subject. She had moved on to other battles. The same year, the largest private residence ever built in New York City met the same fate. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion, which stretched an entire block along Fifth Avenue from 57th to 58th Street, was sold to the Brasted Realty Corporation for $7 million. The price reflected the value of the land, not the 130 rooms that stood on it. Alice Vanderbilt, the widow of Cornelius, had lived alone in the house for nearly 3 decades. Her husband had died in 1899. Her children had scattered to their own homes and their own lives. The mansion required more than 30 servants just to maintain, and the income from her trust fund barely covered the costs. Commercial development had surrounded her on all sides. Hotels and office buildings loomed over the chateau that had once commanded the avenue. She resisted as long as she could. Then she capitulated. A week before the wreckers arrived, Alice opened the house to the public. For 50 cents, anyone could walk through the rooms where the Vanderbilts had entertained presidents and princes. Thousands came. They wanted to see how the highest of high society had lived during an era that was already fading into memory. Then the walls came down. In 1928, the Bergdorf Goodman department store opened on the site. Shoppers now browsed where the Vanderbilts once dined. But Alice saved what she could. The wrought iron gates that had guarded the entrance were donated to Central Park, where they still stand at the conservatory garden. The carved fireplace from the Great Hall went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Sculptural reliefs from the facade ended up in the lobby of the Sherry Netherlands Hotel. The mansion was gone, but fragments of it survived, scattered across the city like relics of a vanished civilization. The Astors lost their palace too. The double mansion at 65th Street, where Caroline had spent her final years receiving fancy guests, was sold and demolished in 1926. The contents were auctioned off first. Paintings, furniture, decorative ceilings, architectural elements, everything had a price. In its place rose Temple Emmanuel, one of the largest synagogues in the world. The old order was being erased. The great families had built monuments to their wealth along Fifth Avenue, and now those monuments were being replaced by monuments to commerce. Bergdorf Goodman, Saks Fifth Avenue, Tiffany's. The names on the buildings changed, but the purpose remained the same. This was where New York came to spend money. The reasons were practical. Maintaining a mansion required an army of servants, and servants had become expensive. Heating the cavernous rooms consumed mountains of coal. The property taxes climbed every year. And the land beneath these houses had become worth more than the houses themselves. A developer could demolish a mansion and build a commercial tower that generated income for decades. The math was simple. The federal estate tax made the calculations even clearer. When a patriarch died, his heirs faced bills that could consume a quarter of the fortune. The only way to pay was to sell assets. And the mansions, which produced no income and cost fortunes to maintain, were the obvious choice. The houses that had taken decades to design and build were liquidated in months. By the end of the 1920s, millionaires' row had become a memory. The brown
Only the ladies and 70s and Satan, or a dream's night in her favorite parkway and fall. What about a spring stroll to the snow and cherry blossoms in Kyoto, or a winter ski trip to the snowy slopes of Jackson Hole? With the protection of an annual plan from Allianz Travel Insurance, you can be ready to go just about anywhere all year round, whenever wanderlust strikes.
The brownstones and chateaus that had lined Fifth Avenue from the 30s to the 50s were almost entirely gone. A few survivors remained further north, where the march of commerce had not yet reached. But everyone knew it was only a matter of time. Some of the Newport cottages fared better. The Breakers still stands on Bellevue Avenue, its 70 rooms preserved exactly as Alice Vanderbilt left them. Her daughter Gladys eventually leased it to the Preservation Society of Newport County for $1 a year. Today, 400,000 visitors walk through the Great Hall each summer, marveling at the opulence of an age when one family could spend $7 million on a vacation. Marble House survives too, the birthday gift that William K. Vanderbilt gave to Alva in 1892. The ballroom where she plotted the suffrage movement's campaigns is open to tourists. The dining room chairs still weigh 75 pounds each. And in the mountains of North Carolina, the largest private home in America remains in the Vanderbilt family. Biltmore, built by George Washington, Vanderbilt II in the 1890s, encompasses 250 rooms on 8,000 acres. It was too remote and too large to demolish. Instead, his descendants opened it to the public in 1930, charging admission to help pay the bills. It remains a private residence and a tourist attraction, a monument to what the Vanderbilt fortune could build when applied to a single property in a single location. These are the survivors. They exist because someone decided to preserve them, to transform private homes into public museums. The alternative was demolition. There was no middle ground. The Fifth Avenue mansions did not survive because no one fought for them. They were private property, and their owners chose to sell. The wrecking crews arrived with legal authority and economic justification. The houses came down and the city moved on. What replaced them was taller, denser, more profitable. The skyline that defines modern Manhattan rose from the rubble of the Gilded Age. The Empire State Building stands where the Astors once feuded. Department stores occupy the land where the Vanderbilts once competed for supremacy. The grandchildren of the men who built railroads now shop at Bergdorf Goodman, perhaps unaware that their great-great-grandfather's dining room once occupied the same ground. The mansions vanished because the world that built them vanished. The fortunes remained, but they were taxed. The families remained, but they scattered. The society that had gathered in those ballrooms dispersed into 1,000 different pursuits. No one needed a house with 130 rooms anymore. No one wanted to pay for 30 servants. The era of conspicuous construction had ended. What remained was the memory, and the photographs, and the fragments in museums, and the summer cottages in Newport, preserved behind velvet ropes, where tourists pay admission to glimpse how the other half once lived. What remains? The war is over. The combatants are gone. Caroline Astor died believing she still ruled a society that had already moved on without her. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont died fighting for causes that would have horrified the world she had once conquered. The fortunes they married into were taxed and divided and dispersed across generations until the name Vanderbilt no longer automatically meant wealth. The social hierarchy that Caroline had policed so carefully collapsed under the weight of immigration, war, and economic transformation. The 400 became a quaint historical footnote, but something remained. The summer cottages at Newport stand largely as their owners left them, preserved not as ruins, but as functioning museums. Tour guides lead visitors through rooms designed to intimidate, explaining the cost of the marble, the weight of the chandeliers, the number of servants required to maintain the illusion of effortless elegance. The houses that once announced to the world that their owners had arrived now announced that an entire way of life was departed. In New York, the great mansions are gone. The fragments survive, scattered across the city, embedded in institutions that serve the public. The private became public. The exclusive became accessible. The monuments to individual wealth became monuments to collective memory. The Gilded Age was not a golden age. The name itself was meant as criticism, coined by Mark Twain to describe an era that glittered on the surface but concealed corruption and exploitation beneath. The mansions were built by workers who would never set foot inside them except as servants. The fortunes were accumulated through practices that would later be outlawed. The society that gathered in those ballrooms excluded almost everyone in America on the basis of birth, religion, or the wrong kind of money. And yet the houses were beautiful. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The ambition, however misdirected, produced structures that still inspire awe. We can condemn the inequality and still admire the architecture. We can learn from the past without wanting to return to it. What remains is the story. Two families, one old and one new, fighting for position in a world they helped create. The houses they built as weapons in that war. The balls and operas and the snubs they delivered and endured. The way they lived, the way they died, the way they are remembered. It is a story about wealth, but not only about wealth. It is a story about belonging, about the human need to be recognized, to be accepted, to matter. Caroline Astor and Alva Vanderbilt were both, in their different ways, trying to answer the same question. Who counts? Who belongs? Who gets to decide? They answered that question for their era. Their answers no longer apply. But the question endured. And each generation must answer it again. The gates are open now. Anyone can walk through. In May 1947, an 84-year-old man left a castle in California for the last time. His health was failing. His doctors insisted he needed medical care that the remote location could not provide. He had been building the castle for 28 years. It was still not finished. William Randolph Hearst never returned to the hilltop estate he had named La Cuesta Encantada, the Enchanted Hill. He died 4 years later in Beverly Hills, having spent the final years of his life away from the only home that had ever truly mattered to him. The castle he left behind contained 165 rooms, 56 bedrooms, 61 bathrooms, indoor and outdoor swimming pools that were engineering marvels, a private zoo that had once been the largest in the world, 127 acres of gardens and terraces, and an art collection so vast it could have filled 10 museums. Hearst had spent an estimated $50 million building his dream. In today's money, over $900 million. He purchased entire ceilings of European palaces and shipped them to California. He bought so much art and so many antiques that warehouses in New York and San Francisco overflowed with pieces he never even unpacked. The castle was designed by Julia Morgan, the first woman licensed as an architect in California. She worked with Hearst for 28 years, patiently managing his constant changes, his impossible demands, and his insatiable desire for more. More rooms, more beauty, more everything. Hearst shared the castle with Marion Davies, a film actress 34 years younger than him. She was his mistress for over 3 decades. His wife refused to grant him a divorce, so Marion could never be his wife. But she was the hostess of his castle, the center of his world, and eventually the person who saved him financially when his empire collapsed. Today, Hearst Castle is one of California's most visited tourist attractions. Over 1 million people tour it annually. The estate that was built as the most private pleasure palace in America became one of its most public treasures. The castle that Hearst never finished has been preserved exactly as he left it. This is the story of how that castle was built, and why the man who created it could never stop building, even when he ran out of time and money to continue. The boy who toured Europe's castles. William Randolph Hearst was born on April 29, 1863 in San Francisco, California. He was the only child of George Hearst and Phoebe Amberson Hearst. The timing of his birth was fortunate. His father was about to become extraordinarily wealthy. George was a mining engineer with an instinct for finding gold and silver where others saw only rock. He had arrived in California during the gold rush of 1849 with almost nothing. By the time his son was born 14 years later, George owned stakes in some of the richest mines in the American West. The Alford mine in Nevada's Comstock Lode made George his first fortune. The Homestake mine in South Dakota would make him even wealthier. By the time William was 10 years old, his father was a millionaire many times over. In an era when a comfortable middle-class income was $2,000 per year, George's mining interests generated hundreds of thousands annually. Phoebe Apperson was 19 years younger than her husband. She had married George when she was 21 and he was 40. The marriage was pragmatic more than romantic. George was often away at mining sites. Phoebe managed their San Francisco household and raised their son largely alone. But Phoebe had ambitions for William that extended far beyond San Francisco. She wanted him to see the world, to understand art and culture, to have opportunities that neither she nor her husband had experienced growing up. In 1873, when William was 10 years old, Phoebe took him on an 18-month tour of Europe. The trip changed William's life. They traveled through England, France, Germany, and Italy. They visited museums and galleries. They attended operas and concerts. And most importantly for William's future, they toured the grand estates of European nobility, medieval fortresses, Renaissance palaces, country houses where aristocratic families had lived for centuries. William was mesmerized. The scale of these buildings, the beauty of their architecture, the way they announced power and permanence. He later wrote that this journey planted a seed that would grow for the rest of his life. He wanted to build something like what he had seen, something that would last for centuries, something that would make people stop and stare. The palaces William saw were centuries old. They had been built by families with inherited titles and land that stretched back generations.